it's really difficult to introduce a person who needs no introduction to the audience that she's going to address. Now, no one's worked harder and longer than Eileen McGuckian to protect things of historic value in Montgomery County. She's served in more positions, goaded more officials, been to more meetings, advised more citizens and property owners, and researched more projects and documented more sites than most people knew existed. In the last 50 years, Eileen has been directly responsible for or influenced most, if not all, of the decisions that resulted in the preservation of major historic landmarks and districts. Her work as executive director of Peerless Rockville with Maryland Historical Trust, Preservation Maryland, Montgomery Preservation, Dickerson Historical Trust, Montgomery Historical Society, protection of burial sites, and other projects that are too numerous to mention without taking all the time that's allotted for her remarks, have resulted in the greatest accolade a preservationist can receive. She left no historic or cultural site uncouthly touched. She's taken her work seriously and has retained enough perspective to appear at one preservationist Halloween party as the little old lady in tennis shoes. And she was once photographed by a newspaper wearing a shirt emblazoned with a ribald quotation, although it was discreetly in Latin, which was, I think, appropriate for a discreet historian. I first met Eileen in the mid-1970s when I'd begun working with Dick Tustian and the staff of the planning board and my colleague George Kephart and Fritz Gutheim on two closely related projects that would become the Agricultural Reserve and the development of a historic preservation plan and ordinance. To help illustrate the importance of both projects, Fritz, Eileen, and Gail Rothrock undertook a project called Sugarloaf Trails to document the historic and cultural values located in Western Montgomery County. I kept the guides that they produced on my desk for about 40 years until finally they disappeared in one move or another. The fruit of their labor and that of Mike Dwyer of the Parks Department became the Historic Atlas of Montgomery County, from which we produced the first Historic Preservation Master Plan and the ordinance that established the Historic Preservation Commission. When it came to create the commission, I presented a list of possible members to the county council, and I described as indefatigable champions of preservation and as experts in history, architecture, and the communities of the county. Eileen was chosen as the first chairman of the commission, and under her leadership, it established a reputation for good judgment, of listening to people, educating the public about the value of preserving representatives of our history, and providing sound professional advice to the planning board, the Board of Appeals, and the council. Eileen was indefatigable then. She is indefatigable now. And it is with immense pleasure that I present to you the indefatigable Eileen McGuckian. Eileen.
All right. Thank you so much, Royce. I'm bringing Eileen there. There she is. Hi, Eileen.
Good morning. Good morning, and thank you, Royce, for that lovely introduction, with some of my secrets included, and the kind words. I'm delighted to be here today. I've had.
Oh, I apologize. I sent the wrong person back. I am very sorry about that, Royce. I'll move you back, and I'm going to move Eileen back. Eileen, I'm so sorry. I accidentally sent you. That is. There we go. I'm so sorry about that, Eileen. I hit the wrong button. I am so sorry. You are good to go. You're good to go. Yep. I'm so sorry.
Okay. All right. Well, good morning to everyone. And thank you, Royce, for your kind words. I'm delighted to be here today. I've had the pleasure of cheering on this conference since it began in 2006 as a gathering of history program volunteers who compared notes and learned from one another. I claim the dubious distinction of being the only person thus far to need to postpone this event for weather. That was in 2012, and we pulled together all the moving parts to hold the conference in person 3 weeks later. My congratulations to all who are involved this year with more topics, more technology, and details to produce this year's history conference. So let's start on my slides, and
I'm here to help as we walk through.
all right, share screen.
Hit share screen. Make sure you hit share sound.
Okay. And then share again.
Yep.
Ooh, okay.
And there we are.
All right, and you're going to take me off of the box on the right-hand side.
Yep, I will go ahead and turn your camera off there. So.
Okay. Okay, so I'm ready to go. All right, thanks again, everyone. I don't need to tell this audience how important it is to know our past and how fascinating it can be. Living and working in Montgomery County, we recognize that all American history events play out one way or another in Montgomery County. So why do we need to preserve buildings? We can read about our history. We can attend programs of Montgomery history. We can see pictures. Why do we need to preserve historic buildings and landscapes in Montgomery County? And who cares? Whoops. All right, I did not.
So you need to click on the actual PowerPoint there. Just click right there. Yep. It should bring it up. Is it not doing that?
I've got the first screen on. Okay.
Okay, there you go. Try it now.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. Okay, and my screen is covering some of the things at the top of my.
It's all there for us.
Computer.
We can see it.
Okay. Okay, good. All right. So here's how I am going to go about doing this with you. We'll talk about I want to introduce you to the history of historic preservation in Montgomery County, why we do need to preserve buildings and landscapes, what is worth preserving here, how preservation works in Montgomery County today, who cares, to whom does it matter, how has preservation been accomplished over the past century, and by, oops. All right, I'm not sure what I did there. I think maybe I do know what I did there. How preservation fits into our world and into our lives today, and why is it so often in the news?
They paved paradise, put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
Well, that's my first adventure into adding a video, an audio into a PowerPoint. Thank you, Ralph Buglas. It worked fine. So if you don't know, that is, I'm sure you know the Joni Mitchell song, the Big Yellow Taxi from 1970, but it's also really the preservationist theme song. So today, here's what I call the Montgomery County Preservation Pantheon. You'll recognize the guy sort of in the center, first row, Royce Hansen, who was already there. You probably are going to identify many, but not all of these folks who are in here. But preservation in Montgomery County would not have been possible without this cast of characters. We officially date from 1776, when the Maryland General Assembly formed Montgomery out of the Western frontier. Over the next 250 years, Black and white pioneers built homes and stores, churches and burial sites, farms and institutions, industrial structures and towns. Over time, we continue to build. We can continue to build, and also, along with that, decided what to keep from our past. Every era, with its demographic and its technologically related changes, inspired new uses and updated architectural visions. The first preservationists in Montgomery County were the owners, people who owned these properties and their descendants who continue to use and cherish them. In the first third of the 20th century, Americans began to express dismay about losing their historic communities. This was happening, as you're probably familiar with, New Orleans, Charleston, South Carolina, Providence, Rhode Island, Savannah, Georgia, and a national historic preservation movement was born. Montgomery County was slow to catch on. Although the Montgomery County Historical Society, formed in 1944 to collect papers and artifacts, visionary planner and activist Frederick Gutheim was compelled in a 1958 speech to exhort Historical Society members to, quote, protect the sacred places of our history and restore those which have been disfigured. So he is way ahead of his time. In the 1960s, the National Historic Preservation Act provided new initiatives. The National Trust for Historic Preservation was chartered by Congress. Historic American Building Survey and Historic American Engineering Record resumed property surveys that were begun in the 1930s with the New Deal. The Maryland General Assembly passed our first state historic preservation law and established the Maryland Historical Trust. Not long after that, Annapolis and Frederick moved to save streetscapes that they called historic districts in their towns. In Montgomery County, Rockville was the first to act. By 1965, the congregation of St. Mary's Church had outgrown the chapel and planned for a larger modern church. The Rockville community supported church members who wanted to keep their history along with the new. This coincided with urban renewal that gutted the traditional main street of Rockville and raised many fine and not so fine old buildings. The red brick courthouse itself was saved by the local AIA chapter, students, particularly fourth graders, and a citizen outcry. The mayor and council enacted an ordinance that was based on the Maryland template and the experience in Annapolis and Frederick, but not until 1972 did Rockville citizens demand protection for early buildings and Victorian streetscapes that together became the first 3 designated historic districts. And you can see the map on which we showed where these historic districts would run down West Montgomery Avenue, South Washington Street, and around the B&O station and St. Mary's Church. This was in 1974. Advocates went on to protect the B&O station, which at that point was slated for removal for the metro tracks, and buildings around Courthouse Square. The 1970s were seminal. With our growing population, Lots of new construction of homes, lots of new kids, lots of schools, shopping centers, office buildings, and often historic places were lost. So it was a gradual but easy jump from documenting and photographing historic places to protecting and preserving them. Citizen groups stepped up. In Tacoma Park, for example, it was energized by the planned expansion of Montgomery College. And you can see the bulldozer eating the Victorian homes here. And in May of 1974, crisis situation spurred the formation of Peerless Rockville. You can see the bulldozer on the right. I took that picture. And Historic Medley District. The years leading up to the US and the Montgomery County Bicentennial reminded us of our history in our own backyards. There was an explosion of interest in local history and genealogy. Remember the impact of roots? Books were written and groups formed to document his communities, Black and white, in Montgomery County. And following Fritz Gutheim's lead, the Sugarloaf Regional Trails that Royce mentioned identified places that you could connect with hiking, biking, and canoeing trails. And the group also studied up-county Black communities and rustic country roads. In 1973, MNCPPC, the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, hired a very young Mike Dwyer to drive his Jeep around the county, best job ever, to visit sites and help create the Locational Atlas and Index of Historic Sites, which was published in 1976. Mike later was joined by Jim Sorensen, who was the archaeological part of that duo. And it's no coincidence that this occurred during the planning board chairmanship of Royce Hansen, whose leadership through the 1970s and into the early 80s was visionary, practical, and instrumental. 1979 to 1980 was a momentous time for planning and for the future of Montgomery County. Those years ushered in not only the Ag Resolve, but also the Master Plan for Historic Preservation. The first Historic Preservation Commission was appointed. The first 61 historic properties were designated on the master plan, and the first historic area work permit was processed. And it was for the building that shows on this screen, the Oaks, which is a 1815 farm off Riggs Road in Laytonsville, and which was on the site of the future landfill. And this was a very contentious thing at the time, the landfill was. And for the public hearing to see whether any alterations could be made or a demolition could be made on this farm property, the little auditorium in the old county office building was absolutely full of people who had signs and were protesting the landfill being established on this property. My job was to explain multiple times during that public hearing that the county had allowed this building to be listed on the master plan under the condition that it would be moved, and that the Preservation Commission could choose 15 of the 21 outbuildings to move along with the house off the site of the landfill. So that was quite an initiation into this. Around the same time, to the joy of preservation advocates nationally, the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in. In addition to a 1954 ruling that preservation of buildings of historic or aesthetic importance is a permissible goal of state action, and that communities have the right to be beautiful as well as healthy, clean, and carefully protected. In the broader Penn Central case, which you probably remember more so in 1978, the court ruled that states and cities may enact land use controls to enhance the quality of life by preserving individual and desirable aesthetic features of a city, and that preservation of landmarks benefits the citizenry economically as well as by improving the overall quality of life. So what do we have in Montgomery County that's worth preserving? Again, you'll recognize some of these pictures and not the others. I deliberately didn't label these, but you will notice that we have schoolhouses, we have large and small buildings along the C&O Canal, we have early commercial buildings, we have lovely farmsteads with the outbuildings, we have burial sites, large and small cemeteries and individual burial sites. We have lovely Victorian residential streetscapes in a lot of our towns. We have religious structures. We have landscapes, we have suburban structures, we have schools, old and new. We have stories to tell. We have the first of its kind. We have the last of its kind. We have the very best of its kind, whatever it might be. It might be the train station, and we have a number of those on the metropolitan branch here. We have places that are associated with notable persons, events, groups, communities, historical themes. We have national, state, and local themes to pronounce. We have older and newer buildings. You'll recognize a lot of these, some in transit. I should say that naysayers did and still do live in Montgomery County. Some people would not have bothered to save the red brick courthouse, that little schoolhouse or cemetery in the woods, the damaged Dickerson or Silver Spring train stations, the farmhouse on acreage planned to become new home sites, or the Board of Education headquarters. I'm glad that through our recent history, our decision makers have disagreed with them. So let's take a look at how historic preservation works in Montgomery County today. Again, we go back to the importance of owners of historic properties. It's also now, since 1980 or 1979, a function of local government in Montgomery County. Partners are non-government and non-profit organizations. And there will be other preservation interests and others who care. So let's look at the frontliners first. Whether they are homeowners, and here's the Oaks again, whether they're businesses, whether they're religious organizations, cemetery caretakers, they're all responsible for maintaining their buildings and land. They are absolutely the key to historic preservation in Montgomery County. And you'll see both current and past examples here. Many of these owners have found creative uses for special structures to remain economically viable. Particularly want to point out economically viable uses on every slide that I've shown in the last 3 slides, but this one particularly. If you haven't been down to the new African American History Museum, when you go, be sure to see the Jones Sims house. This was a trivia question in last night's contest, by the way. It is an example of post-Civil War African American life. And there's a wonderful exhibit about it. And the building itself was taken apart from Jonesville, near Poolsville in Upper Montgomery County, and put together piece by piece as an exhibit in the museum. And a shout out to the Girl Scouts who rescued Rockwood, and a shout out to the business owners who saved the old Perry store in Potomac, and of course the mayor and council in Rockville for having the Glenview Mansion as its civic center. So let's look at how this is a function of local government. And while property owners are key, this is also key to how historic preservation actually is accomplished. There are laws and protections at the federal, at the state, and at the local levels. But for most of us, our county government is the level at which we are most impacted, where it makes the most difference. Places designated on the master plan for historic preservation are meant to be preserved. It's like another functional master plan that Montgomery County Park and Planning and the county government adhere to. The places that are on this master plan are meant to be preserved. It is the intent of government to protect historic resources, not to limit property owners. There are two specific processes that are involved. One is the evaluation of the property's significance. And it could be in single site, or it could be a full historic district. The other is after a property is determined significant and is on the master plan, and any changes are proposed to be made to it by its owner, that the commission, and we'll talk about the details of all this, the commission must determine whether these proposed changes are appropriate, detrimental, or compatible with the historic site, which is meant to be preserved. So I'm sorry I'm getting into the weeds, but I think you need this to understand. And of course, you may ask questions. We'll have questions and answers afterwards. So there are criteria for everything, of course. So these criteria are encoded in the Montgomery County Code, section 24A, and that specific section of it. So individual sites go through the evaluation process. Individual sites and historic districts, they may be nominated for designation on the master plan by an owner or by interested parties. They could be nominated by the government. They could be nominated by an architectural group, a local historic preservation group, former owners, whatever it is. The criteria are specified in the law, and you will see here that they are about architectural style and quality. They're about historic and cultural value, whether it might be associated with a person, a group, an event. And using these criteria, the Historic Preservation Commission, known now as the HPC to you, staff and commission evaluate the nomination, and a public hearing is held. A favorable nomination then goes to the planning board, which conducts a hearing and a work session. Then it prepares its own recommendation and transmits it to the Montgomery County Council. The county council holds another hearing. You're hearing a lot of public input here, and a work session, then approves, disapproves, or amends the recommendation. And if approved, it becomes an amendment to the master plan for historic preservation. My little picture in here is of Capitol View Park with a street address of Silver Spring. Capitol View Park was the first historic district designated in Montgomery County. The second process is what happens when someone wants to alter a designated site. When an owner wants to add a new wing onto it, or an upper story onto a house, an existing house, wants to tear down part or all of a structure, build a new garage, or change the total appearance of a building, you have to have an historic area work permit, hereafter known as a HAWP, H-A-W-P, that must be filed along with the building permit with the Department of Permitting Services. So at the same time that it goes for building permit, if that is required, it goes to the Historic Preservation staff at Montgomery Planning. The Historic Preservation Commission, HPC, invites the owner and the public to a hearing to review the application for its compatibility with the historic property. and it determines whether to approve the application outright, approve with conditions, or to deny the proposal. The HPC bases its decisions on the standards in the Secretary of the Interior Standards and Guidelines for Rehabilitation. So sometimes different disinformation and even fear comes in here when you're looking at proposing changes to properties and people having opinions on whether they are appropriate or not. So let's take a look at the facts here. This is a list of a short list of what the HPC reviews, what designation does not cover, and what the HPC can and cannot do. The historic district zone is an overlay zone. It does not affect use. It does not affect or even consider the interior of a property. It does not consider ordinary maintenance of a structure. For designated properties, the law requires that any proposed changes and additions that don't follow what I just mentioned, that is not covered, to be reviewed by the HPC. As I mentioned, applications for the HOPs and for building permits can be processed simultaneously and usually are. Individual sites and those in an historic district are eligible for tax benefits to assist property owners. You can see that the attempt here is to balance personal property rights and the public's right to protect its history. So the HPC, and there are a few members here of the recent members of the HPC, along with some few recent members of staff, just so an idea you can see that they are real people. Many of them are property owners of historic sites in Montgomery County. Some of them are architects, some are historians, some are involved with landscape professions, transportation, building, construction, research, those kinds of things. But these are the 9 folks who volunteer to meet every other Wednesday evening and look at evaluations and protections or applications for change. It's a fact that property owners have been mostly satisfied over these years with how, and we're talking about 40 years now, with how their applications have been handled. They appreciate the observations and suggestions from the HPC staff initially and from commissioners when they get to the commissioner level. Records for the years 2018 to the present show that each year the HPC has approved more than 230 applications for changes. And since about 2021, there is the ability for staff to approve certain minor changes, and these have amounted to another 100 for the year, for each year. The carrot that goes along with the stick are tax credits. They're financial. Historic tax credits provide an incentive for owners of master plan sites to restore their properties, to maintain them, to put in historic and appropriate additions and changes, not to tear them down. The reports from the Historic Preservation Office shows that there were 935 applications for tax credits over a 7-year period. And that enables owners to select experienced contractors to conduct the best work for their needs, or to simply be able to be reimbursed for some of the expenses, sometimes more expensive, sometimes not, than you would on an ordinary house. The eligibility for property tax credits is limited to sites that are listed on the master plan for historic preservation. They can get credit for documented expenses for exterior maintenance, restoration, or preservation work. The credit may be, well, some examples would be adding storm windows, exterior painting, repairing architectural features or ornaments, repairing roofs, collective repairs if the repair cost about at least $1,000 during a year. Repairing roofs and so on, uncovering or repairing the original sidings. It's always a cheer when that happens. Professional services such as architectural or engineering or color consulting, that sort of thing. And the work must have been completed with an historic area work permit if such a thing was required. Your property, if it's also on the National Register of Historic Places, may also be eligible for state and federal tax credits as well. So for more information about tax credits, the tax credit applications are due on April 1st of each year, no fooling. And there is a session on March 2nd that is being held by the HPC. There's a place to sign up, register for that session. And that is on Thursday, March 2nd, coming up in another month or so to help you with that. So also to mention to you that this law and the processes that I've explained to you covers most of the properties in Montgomery County, and it parallels other charter counties in Maryland. It includes most towns that never incorporated in Montgomery County, such as Germantown, Sandy Spring, Durwood, Silver Spring, Boyds, Dickerson. The county law does not apply to several incorporated municipalities, except those whose planning and zoning are conducted under MNC PPC. So the ones who have chosen in the past, maybe as early as the 1920s, even though they're incorporated, that they would like Montgomery County to do their planning and zoning, include Kensington, Brookville, Garrett Park, and Tacoma Park. All of those are under the historic preservation law for the county. The county law does not apply to the separate incorporated municipalities, which are Rockville, Gaithersburg, Laytonsville, and Poolesville. Some of these incorporated towns who do their own historic preservation programs have their own HDCs, their own staff, and the details that I mentioned to you are similar. I know this is a little bit confusing. Tried to do the best I could to make it more concise for you, and that's why we have question and comment periods at the end. So we have property owners, we have government involvement, and another important vital role really in helping Montgomery County identify, advocate for, and preserve historic places is the nonprofit and preservation organization sector. I'll start with Montgomery Preservation, for whom I'm speaking today, but it is the only countywide organization, nonprofit, that specifically is organized to preserve, protect, and promote historic sites and landscapes countywide. There are other organizations who touch on that, and we're very pleased for them, but Montgomery Preservation is the one, also known as MPI, one that is statewide, countywide. It was formed in 1984. Its signature event is an annual award program that over the decades has recognized hundreds of individuals, groups, and projects. MPI rescued the B&O station also after a disastrous accident left the building in ruins, and today it opens it for Saturday family open houses, for rentals and other gatherings. And most recently, MPI successfully lobbied for protective cemetery legislation at the county and state level, and turned a large volunteer project over to the planning board to become the official county burial sites inventory. So there are some 40 preservation groups. The oldest nonprofits are Historic Medley, Peerless Rockville, Preservation Maryland at the statewide level. Among the most effective that we have are those groups, plus the ones in Germantown, Sandy Spring, and Damascus, Save Our Seminary in Forest Glen, Chevy Chase Historical Society. Thank you for sponsoring. Tacoma Park, Button Farm in Germantown, and Pleasant View in Darnestown. Some of them operate museums with exhibits and programs, including the Museum, Sugarland, Ethnocentric program outside of Poolesville, Gaithersburg, Button Farm, and Boyd's. The newest nonprofit of the 40-some that we have in Montgomery County is Bethesda Historical Society, which took off running 3 years ago. All of these organizations are listed on the MPI website. Every one of them would welcome volunteers and supporters. So you can see a list of them and links to their websites, and you can see examples of past MPI awards over 34 years where you on the website as well, where there are stellar examples of restoration, rehabilitation, and rescues as well.
Eileen, are you still there?
I'm still here.
Okay.
I did not fall asleep.
Okay, it got quiet there and I was responding to emails.
No. I'm still getting used to pushing this one button instead of my mouse. Okay. So who else cares about historic places in Montgomery County today? It's no longer only little old ladies in tennis shoes. My early preservation heroes were a grand dame in Annapolis and an auto parts businessman in Frederick. The explosion of interest in local history and genealogy produced new advocates. Today, preservationists include neighborhood activists, architects, farmers, planners, lifelong Montgomery Countyans, newcomers, civic associations, community historians, local authors, photographers, descendants of people who use those historic sites. Former students and teachers are advocates, train buffs, Civil War buffs, Eagle Scout projects. I love the middle school twins who won a C-SPAN prize recently for a documentary about a neglected cemetery. I greatly admire the DAR chapters in Montgomery County, and two of them are shown represented on this slide right here. There are 10 chapters operating in Montgomery County and one SAR, Sons of the American Revolution chapter. Historic preservation has traditionally been one of the DAR missions, and they do get involved at a very basic level. The same is true for the Art Deco Society of Washington, D.C. So here are some descendants, engineers on a recently awarded bridge that Montgomery County chose to keep rather than destroy, and some of these kids that we enjoy so much. So to name other local groups who are interested in preservation in Montgomery County, these aren't all of them: Montgomery County Civic Federation, Montgomery Countryside Alliance, and of course, Montgomery History. And in Montgomery County, as many of you know and experience, the U.S. Department of the Interior, which keeps the prestigious National Register of Historic Places. It also keeps the list of designated National Historic Landmarks, of which we have 5 in Montgomery County. And you heard about the most recent one last week in Rockville. And this year, many county groups are joining railroad fans from all over, any ages, to celebrate the B&O Metropolitan Branch 150th anniversary in 2023. That was an easy answer to a trivia question last night. But the group has formed, and many groups are participating in it. There will be a lot of programs and events that are going to start soon, and they will continue through the month of May, which is the actual anniversary of when the first train rolled through in May of 1873. So you should visit the Montgomery Preservation website for details and a full calendar of events. So the state of Maryland also recognizes the value of historic preservation and heritage tourism. I think tourism is usually the first, second, or third most important economic driver in the state on a regular basis. But the state, through the Maryland Historical Trust, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and Maryland Heritage Areas are major programs involved in that. The Montgomery County has had its own heritage area since the beginning, and ours features 4 themes: transportation trails, crossroads and cultures, heritage gems, and the Ag Reserve. So when Heritage Montgomery sponsors its annual Heritage Days at the end of June, it's a full weekend of events, some of our 40 or so local groups will open their sites free of charge and their programs open to the public. It is well worth watching for that. Playing another major role is Montgomery Parks, which protects and interprets and owns 37,200 sites of natural and cultural resources in Montgomery County. Within its 420 parks, there are 43 historic properties, almost 300 archaeology sites, and 14 cemeteries, all of which reflect multiple aspects of local history. We are truly blessed with these lands and a terrific cultural resources staff in charge of stewardship. One of the best interpretations in Montgomery County, as I hope you know, and it has been an international buzz for several years since it's been open, is the Josiah Henson Museum and Park south of Rockville. One disappointment is the longtime neglect of historic Jessup Blair Mansion and Park in South Silver Spring. So I'm going to put a plug in for hoping that that will move up in the park's budget priorities soon. So let's look at current preservation issues. I don't want to read to you, but one thing that we need to do is to proactively, don't wait for a crisis, document and evaluate sites that are not yet either on the locational atlas or on the master plan for historic preservation. In our county, we have designated relatively few historic sites and districts. The percentage of designated places here and across the nation is minuscule compared to the sheer volume of buildings that are not eligible, in addition to so much new construction that we have. And then, importantly, we need to enforce the current protections that we have for endangered sites. Even designated buildings must be kept track of. There are 2 examples of sites that have been designated on the master plan, and they really need some prodding. Their owners need some prodding to be able to make sure that they are in tip-top shape and not vulnerable to further deterioration. One is the Jessup Blair House that I mentioned before, and another is the Bethesda Meeting House on Wisconsin Avenue that you might be familiar with. I'll talk about modern architecture in a minute, but we're looking at attracting new generations, new residents, continuing to balance all the public interests that are involved, recognizing the costs of maintenance, restoration, and documentation, and assisting property owners with that, creating fresh uses, continuing to be creative as owners have been, celebrate preservation, and make sure that your appointed and elected public officials who are determining our future must be convinced that preservation is not only vital, but also the wish of those who live and work in Montgomery County. There are lots of pressures for development, but many ways and many options to grow while keeping the best of our past. So to pull out one of those current issues, the disappearance of mid-century modern historic resources in Montgomery County. The The ones pictured here are still all in existence. You may be familiar with the ComSat building and the Perpetual building in Silver Spring. And if you don't have a copy of Montgomery Modern, which was published by Montgomery Planning and written by Claire Lise Kelly a few years ago, which puts really our modern buildings into perspective. They those are still standing. I showed you some of the ones we've lost, and I'll show you a few more. The two others on this list, on this screen right now, one is Weller's Cleaners, and the other is the school in Boyd's, Edward U. Taylor Elementary School. And both of these sites are up for a designation consideration before the planning board. They are on the planning board agenda for February 23rd for public hearings and for input from people, and for the planning board to make a decision as to whether either or both of these buildings meet the criteria for historic designation. So as Joni Mitchell tells you, once it's gone, it's gone. Some of the buildings here, like the Wheaton Youth Center and the Rockville Library, no longer exist. Others are endangered. And we would like to keep them around. Okay, so back to the title of my talk. Why does historic preservation matter? Bear with me. It fosters a sense of place, a quality of life, a stability, and community pride. It provides us with a sense of continuity, with well-being and belonging. It is documented to revitalize neighborhoods, business districts, and communities. It definitely protects distinctive architectural and settings in these communities, and enables us to appreciate the architecture and history around us. Preservation protects neighborhood character from teardowns and incompatible development. It has been documented to maintain and enhance property values. It encourages and attracts small businesses, maintains scenic areas, streetscapes, and landscapes for everyone. It saves our built and visual legacy for the future, aids our climate. Our landfills are overwhelmed with materials from destroyed buildings. Designation, as you've seen in the process, inspires a deeper consideration if a property is negatively affected. So that's true of public projects that might be going on adjacent to or involving historic properties. And lastly, but not leastly, sustains our limited resources and the craftsmanship it takes to do that. So why it matters in preservation matters in Montgomery County today. Here, the history that surrounds us is critical to our sense of place and our quality of life. History is not only museums and biographies and photographs, it's in our own backyards, and we need to protect it for ourselves and for future generations. Preservation enables us to see, to touch, and more clearly understand the places that shaped us and the values that people who were here before us placed on their communities. Old buildings anchor our lives, and they define everyone's culture. They appear above ground, they hide below ground. Preservation is good for our community, for our economy, and our lives. It's a major component of the construction industry. As a practical matter, it reuses materials and infrastructure, and it spends money on local labor. Furthermore, it feels right to save special places. They remind us of how we got to where we are today. We need to see the same landscape, walk on the same ground, enter the same building, hold the same artifacts as those who came before us. Preservation of good architecture enlivens our lives, and it keeps us from being pinned down with the deadly sameness of all new construction. And we need to protect and preserve it. All of you history buffs out there, those who like older properties in your neighborhood, or where you shop, I challenge you to help save sites that reflect our county's history and architecture. I challenge you to join this pantheon of Montgomery County preservation. And as Joni says again,
They paved paradise, put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? They paved paradise, put up a parking lot. They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
so thank you so much for attending this talk. And I am also want to call out Matt Gagel for his guidance and patience, and the Chevy Chase Historical Society for sponsoring this project. And I am happy to take any questions you have and listen to any comments that you have.
Okay, thank you so much, Eileen. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to turn your camera on here. Give me 1 second. There we go. And I will start mine as well. All right. Let's make a slide. All right. So again, thank you so much for that presentation. I think that was great. Although my video just disappeared. There we go. Okay. So I have a question here. Someone asks, why aren't there any significant historic commercial areas like in downtown Frederick? Why was Frederick saved and Rockville was literally bulldozed?
Good question. Number one, Frederick in the 60s had the auto part salesman that I was mentioning. His name was Bernie Callan, and he had a business in downtown Frederick, and he was a runner, and he ran through all of those places and realized their importance. And, you know, Frederick has a much larger, much older, much more intact business district than any of the towns in Rockville, in Montgomery County ever had, including Rockville. Once we lost Georgetown, we lost that major urban feeling. So that is the main reason. If you look at Rockville, it did have a business district, and it was a linear district, not as many blocks spread out in all directions around a center as you see in Frederick or Annapolis, for example. It was just planned to be, the original town was planned to be Courthouse Square, and then subdivisions around it, some of which were commercial and some of which were residential, and residentials are pretty close in, and they still are. So in the late 1950s, by the late 1950s, Rockville finally got the bypass that it had been asking for years, and Hungerford Drive was put in, so cars no longer needed to go through what you know as East Montgomery Avenue and the main street of Rockville to then make a right turn on Washington Street and continue going north to Gaithersburg and points beyond. So there wasn't as much traffic through there. The stores were deteriorating. The malls started to be built around. You're talking about Wheaton Plaza, you're talking about some of the other shopping centers, but places like Wheaton and Silver Spring already we have the Silver Spring Shopping Center, for example, so those are places to go to. By the late 1950s, Congressional Plaza had been built, so there was less and less reason to get mired down in the lack of parking and the the fewer shops that still remained in Rockville. So the mayor and council of Rockville had public hearings, had lots of comments, had a referendum on what to do about this. And there were, I think, 5 different businesses, companies who bid on bringing their vision to Rockville and doing what they could for downtown. One of them was to keep the downtown. That one was not accepted. All the 4 others were to tear almost everything down and build all over again. So in the 1950s, the federal government had this new program called Urban Renewal. And by the end of that program, some 800 communities throughout the US took advantage of the federal government funding 90% of your project to get rid of what you didn't want anymore, and to save how much, what specific buildings that you want to save. So Rockville ended up tearing down some I'd have to look at the specific number, but something like more than 100 buildings that were torn down. Close to 40 of them were saved within the urban renewal area and around it, and you see those today. And to tear down what they didn't want, and to build up what the new concept was, with what we now call town center, with mixed use, spreading government operations, more commercial, more office, more residential, and more public spaces. And that's what you see today. And of course, if you've been in Montgomery County for longer than 20 years or so, you know that the town center has gone through its iterations as well. So our history just wasn't in our favor. I think there aren't too many people around now who wouldn't favor having gone with a Frederick or Annapolis route in Rockville today, but we're saving the best that we can. And, it's still always a challenge. Hope that answers the question.
Okay. Well, they had a follow-up. Are there still federal incentives like urban renewal that work against historic preservation?
Good question. I'm sure there's both. I know there are some incentives for preservation, federal and state and local incentives, but there still are incentives to tear down the old and that you don't like anymore for whatever excuse you want to give. It's in bad shape. It's too small. It doesn't allow for underground parking. Whatever it is. And it's not usable for a modern use. So there are places where you can take advantage of federal programs to help you do that as well.
Okay. Someone asks, how do national historic landmarks fit into the local story?
Well, there's nationally, there's the National Register of Historic Places. And that is a list that was started in the 1960s with the National Historic Preservation Act to have a stronger set of criteria and than most local governments and local areas have. But to take the best of the best across the country, both sites and districts, and put them on a list that would be kept by the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service. So that's the National Register. And in the case, for example, of tax incentives, being on the National Register certainly helps that, helps you keep to that. Those properties are also eligible for tax credits. And when a federally funded, licensed, or somehow involved project, whether it be an interstate highway or an interstate bridge, or federal money is going into a project somehow, National Register sites are considered. You have to go through what's called the Section 106 process. And at any given time in Montgomery County, there are 106 processes in process. National Historic Landmarks are a cut above that. And there are 5 or 6 National Historic Landmarks in Montgomery County, and those are individual buildings like the Gaithersburg Observatory behind Gaithersburg High School, which is a National Historic Landmark, and the most recent Montgomery County National Historic Landmark is Frida's Cottage in Rockville. The National Park Service also has National Historic Sites, national parks like the C&O Canal, and we are fortunate to have all of those kinds of groupings in Montgomery County.
Okay.
Only our local government goes through that process of the evaluations and the changes. Okay.
Okay. What is the biggest challenge currently for any building or area in attempting to get preservation status that has yet to obtain the status? So what challenges do these places or buildings face?
Well, I guess the easiest way is to mention examples. So if you are an older commercial building in Silver Spring, for example, if you are a 1930s shopping center that happens to have a spectacular theater attached to it, if you are a dry cleaning business, and that was started in the 30s. If you're a dry cleaning business like Weller's, started in 1961 with all the Googie architecture. If you are an office building that maybe has 5 stories of it along Georgia Avenue or Colesville Road. If you look at the master plans that and the special planning that has been done and all the input that's happened with that and over the last 5 to 10 years, I'd say that's where most of the challenge is. It seems to me a real shame to automatically toss out buildings because they're only 3 stories of housing, like the Falklands, which are National Register, as well as mostly locally designated, to throw those out when you have perfectly serviceable, affordable, moderate income housing already being used. Why would you trash something in a beautiful setting that works very well for people who've lived there for many years? You could also take some of these office buildings that are deemed to be outmoded, and you can very easily, and they do this in Frederick and Annapolis, you can and DC particularly nicely convert them into condominiums or multifamily dwellings with any price range that you want. A real challenge to our elected officials to allow that sort of thing. So that's where I see the most pressure now. Although the Ag Reserve, as the Montgomery Countryside Alliance and Sugarloaf Trails and the Sugarloaf Citizen Association, everyone up that way knows, in the eastern and the western parts of the county, it's a constant challenge to keep the ideals and the mission and the purpose of the and the working capability of the Ag Reserve. Constant challenge with looking to take working farms and develop them into something higher and better use.
Okay. Susan Soderberg, who is in your presentation.
Yeah.
Yes, she's great. How can we convince property owners to allow historic designation of their property if tax incentives don't work? And then this is kind of a tie on to that I think kind of is important to answer together. Can an owner be compelled to maintain an historic building to head off demolition by neglect?
Okay. Separately, if it's an owner who can't take advantage of tax credits, I've seen many instances where tax-paying components of a project will come in. It won't be only a nonprofit that doesn't pay taxes, for example, that owns the property but a tax-paying component might be involved in renting it or in restoring the property, putting an addition onto it, and bring it into a new use. So there are a lot of examples, not only in Montgomery County, but in places all over Maryland, all over the country, where you can look at creative uses for older buildings that can become tax paying places. Montrose School, for example, the nonprofit owner of that Peerless Rockville, when it is rented out, that rent is taxable. I mean, the fact that it is an income producing property, it is taxable. So they will, Peerless Rockville will look to get tax credits on the work it's about to do on Montrose Schoolhouse. In terms of making people keep up their properties, we do have a demolition by neglect section in the Montgomery County ordinance, which I happen to have a copy of right here. Demolition by neglect is the same thing as bulldozing on purpose. So it is not supposed to happen. And there have been very few pursuances of demolition by neglect in Montgomery County. I personally remember one instance, and this is probably in the 90s, of a house that stood on what was then the corner of the Frederick Road, Route 355, and where 121 came in. An absolutely lovely, I think a Greek Revival house. And it was being demolished by neglect, and we decided to make that an instance of to go through pursuing, charging the owner with demolition by neglect. And even though financial hardship is one of the things that a court or actually an appeal board would look at, we didn't win that case, and the building is gone. It was today you would probably be happy to have that in Clarksburg today as part of the growing Clarksburg and the growing interest in the historic places in Clarksburg. So I think demolition by neglect ought to be followed a little more. It's one of the things that I think that should be enforced more in Montgomery County. The DC has, Washington DC's preservation ordinance includes properties that are being considered for designation as properties that will be protected under the ordinance for a limited amount of time while that evaluation is going on. That would seem to me to be a good thing to do in Montgomery County. It would prevent the fire in the middle of the night that happens to demolish a building that is being considered for demolition. And I'm sorry, that is and for redevelopment. That has happened in Montgomery County, sorry to say. So Susan, I hope that answers the question.
Okay. It was actually a second person who asked the question about the demolition about neglect, but they were tied together.
Okay.
Okay. So I've had a couple people ask about the ComSat building that you can see along I-270 in Clarksburg. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on with that? Are there plans to save it? What's its status?
Well, I'm not sure I have the most up-to-date information, and someone with Montgomery Planning may know some more. My last information, which is a few years old, is that the building has continued to be vacant. It's on quite a large bit of acreage. It was the subject of a charrette that and coming together of people to try to figure out what to do with this glorious building, beautifully designed by Cesar Pelli, who actually attended the charrette. Modernist building, acclaimed, and as far as I know, it is still just there. I think that there have been a couple of proposals for it that simply haven't gone through. And I think that's because of the economy at any given time. It is not a designated historic site. It should be in Montgomery County. It is, and I'll go back to a previous answer, it is fair game for a place where you would use the original stunning architectural building, mid-century modern, and use that as the crown jewel in an overall development, much larger development. And that certainly could happen. Love to see someone step up. If you're out there or you know someone out there, now's a good time to do that. We're talking about so much new construction that we need to house everybody we want to maintain and keep in Montgomery County. That's a good example of what one modern development could do to fix up the CompSat building and then around it build other needed structures.
Okay. I think it's a beautiful building. It is. I would hate to see something happen to it, but
well, that doesn't happen naturally.
Yes.
The hating may come naturally, but saving it does not come naturally.
Yep. Okay. Someone says, I was surprised that changes to building interiors of historic sites don't require approval. Aren't some of these historic and aren't some of these historic interiors worth preserving too? Doesn't DC require approval? What do you think of Montgomery County not requiring it?
Okay. Montgomery County has never required it, but it could if it were to change the ordinance. DC, I'm not familiar with their entire ordinance, but I know that they do designate interiors. I think New York is the interior capital of the US that started doing that. New York and Chicago both have designated interiors, which require permits to change them. I don't know whether Baltimore does with any of its wonderful interiors. I'm not aware that it does. Montgomery County could if it wanted to. There's never been a big push for that. I do agree there are some extraordinary interiors, even some homes, some simple and some very ornate, would make wonderful interior designations as well as the exterior of it. But we don't do that now. Often public buildings or semi-public buildings or popular buildings like theaters are the ones that get the interior designations. I'd love to see Montgomery County do that for specific buildings. And it's not that we don't have the architecture and the features to warrant that. It's just that we have not done that.
Okay.
And by the way, I should say, when you look at your tax credits, when you look at the assessment on your house, if you are a designated historic site, you can go in and argue that since you don't have, essentially there is a public easement on the exterior of your property, and in that case, the interior, if that were to happen, that would lessen the value, the assessment value of your house. Again, it's that balance of property rights and public interest, and how much do we care and how much do we want to help the people who do the things we want them to do.
Okay. We just talked about the CompSat building, but
Yeah.
Are there any late 20th century buildings in Montgomery County that are on the radar to preserve?
Depends on what you mean by late. CompSat, I think, is 60s or 70s. Both Wellers Wellers is a 60s building. The Perpetual building in Silver Spring, both in Silver Spring, are 60s buildings. There are other 60s buildings there. The Edward U. Taylor School is a 50s building. I'd like to see more. Edward U. Taylor was one of a small grouping of buildings, school buildings, constructed just before Brown versus Board of Education. So in the early 1950s, the Board of Education finally listened to what Black teachers had been asking and parents had been advocating for years, and they had another consolidation of older schools, as they had done in the 30s, and shut down some schools. And they built Edward U. Taylor, named for the first Black superintendent of schools, or, you know, an assistant superintendent really, but supervising the Black schools. Rock Terrace in Rockville. Carver High School and Junior College was built in that same little round of them. So a group of those buildings would be mid-19th century, all built in the early 1950s. Carver is a designated historic site, and it is so against the initial reluctance of the Board of Education, but the number of people who attended that school, who marched in along with groups like Peerless Rockville and MPI to say this is a really important building when it's the only colored high school in the entire county. You know, that would be worth saving. There are some architecturally significant buildings by known architects. Some of them are in subdivisions like the Charles Goodmans, or they might be in planned subdivisions. Newmark Commons in Rockville, for example, is on the National Register. And Carter Rock is on the National Register as well. So you have groupings of buildings. But you have cemeteries that have not too many of them were established in the late 20th century. Most of them were established in the late 19th or in the 19th century and into the 20th century. I'd like to see some of those be identified more than just in the burial sites inventory and designated on the master plan for extra protection. So I think it's, you know, the locational atlas was done in 1976. Mike Dwyer basically used a 1879 atlas to find the historic places. And then he threw in some others that he was aware of and that other people were aware of. We've done some updates since. There have been, the planning board has funded some studies like Montgomery Modern. That book should not stay on the shelf. That book should be protecting places like the County Detention Center, about which you'll hear in another hour or so, the round building that you see on 270, ComSat, other really very nicely designed places. So we don't lose a whole chunk of when innovated architecture and built by important people, important groups, was added to Montgomery County's her array of historic places.
Okay, well, we are really close to our time. Eileen, you've done a fantastic job. And I apologize that I've not been able to get to everyone's questions. There's so many, but we do have other sessions this afternoon. If people have preservation questions, what's the best way to get in touch with you or to get in touch with Montgomery Preservation? Okay,
so look on this last slide that is up and you'll see two URLs on there. The first is Montgomery Planning, and that takes you directly to the planning department and to the historic preservation part of it. So that's where you'll find information about historic area work permits, about tax credits and that sort of thing, and whether buildings are already designated on the plan, you know, on the master plan. Montgomery Preservation is the URL right below that. That's MPI. And there's just a variety of things, from information about the B&O celebration that's happening this spring, to a calendar of events that are going on throughout the county. information about historic cemeteries, advocacy information, both, the things that are coming up will be on there as well. And they both have ways that you can write to or call either the planning department, or you can write to Montgomery Preservation. There's just a email address, and fortunately I'm not the one who picks it up, but I get them referred to me, and I'm happy to answer them. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And I'm just going to close on this last question because I think it will highlight the sense of urgency in this work. So what was the most significant historic preservation loss in the county's history? And what is the single most important building that is threatened today?
Oh boy, it's like making me choose among my children.
Well, they're probably not watching, so you
You're right. So the single loss, I think I'm going to say Rockville's Main Street. Okay. And other people will disagree, and I could have said four other options. I don't have too much time. The single most important one today, I'm going to split it between the Bethesda Meeting House, which is the church that named Bethesda, and you all know it, up on the hill, which has a private owner who doesn't want to do anything to fix it up, and Jessup Blair, which is owned by Montgomery Parks on Georgia Avenue. But I see, all the buildings that I've mentioned as potential losses, and we still go back through things like the red brick courthouse. Montgomery County is going to be celebrating our whatever the number. It's 275 years soon, and that courthouse needs some fixing up, needs some preservation and restoration priorities geared towards it. And then, the train stations. I don't know. I've
The
never.
list is endless.
Yeah, and I love cemeteries. I haven't met too many historic buildings I don't love. So, all right.
I'm afraid to ask which ones you didn't, but we'll go ahead and close on that note. So Eileen, thank you so much for your great presentation. There's definitely work to be done, and we appreciate your presentation. I encourage everyone to join us for our breakout sessions if your ticket includes access to that, and for our closing session. I think you'll enjoy the film clips from Ilana Truckman at Glen Echo. So again, thanks, Eileen, and we'll see you later.
Okay.
Bye.